You are listening to the Julie Parker Practice Success Podcast, where you discover management insights and strategies for your successful dental practice. There are also interviews with key people in the industry who have advice and services to help you and your team achieve great success. Welcome to this week's episode of the Julie Parker Practice Success Podcast. And today we are delving into a not often discussed aspect of dental practice management. It's an area where I've been quite ignorant, even though I've worked in dental practices for my whole career, and that is radiation. Our dental radiation inside our surgeries, such an enormously important topic. So I'm thrilled that we're joined today by one of the co-founders of Gamatech. It's a New South Wales-based company, and that founder is Makenzie Harris. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
That's just fantastic. You know, we were just having a brief chat before we started recording here, just about the level of unawareness that we do have, many of the staff members within a dental practice has, around the management of radiation, the regulations, what's required, safety measures, all the rest of it. And you are a radiation expert. So tell us a little bit about the history of Gamatech and your journey to this point, so we understand what Gamatech actually does.
Sure, yeah. Great intro. So Gamatech was founded about 2 years ago. I am one of the co-founders, as you mentioned. And both of us, our co-founders, came from a background with medical devices. My personal background is engineering. So I was the person that would be working on the units themselves, installing them, calibrating them, ensuring that they themselves are functioning correctly and safely. Throughout my tenure working with medical equipment, I would often run into the people that came in after us to do the compliance testing, and really, really intrigued me a little bit, the safety side of it, the regulatory side of it. And so I personally went out and I got a mentor. I did further physics and a few other courses to get accredited through the EPA to be qualified to do these compliance tests on these types of units. Really important for the units and for the safety of the practice. We always say that knowing your environment is the first step to safety, and being educated in your surroundings is a really big principle that we try and push through with Gamatech.
Yeah, I tell you what, I was recently interviewing from Biohygiene Jürgen Hinkfuss. I think I've pronounced his surname correctly. And he has got a company where they are manufacturing chemicals, traditional chemicals that we use in the surgeries, that are far safer for the people within the workplace themselves. And that was a huge eye-opener for me, that, goodness me, look at all these chemicals that we're using, and look at all the hazardous signs that are on the labels that I've since gone blind to. You know, you get so used to seeing these things, and you're like, yeah, it's a hazard, whatever. But we forget that we really have to maintain that safe working environment, and it's worthy of re-looking at every aspect that impacts the health of the people that are working in that practice with fresh eyes. So you've got those fresh eyes coming in. You know exactly the impact of an unsafe radiation work environment. You know about the regulations specifically really to New South Wales, and how we as a team can make sure that we're managing our radiation appliances effectively, our X-ray machines effectively.
That's correct. And really good point that you did state out that we are here in New South Wales practicing, because as I'm sure you're aware, throughout the different states, there is a different regulatory body. There is a different set of regulations for each of the different states. So that's good that we do specify we are in New South Wales, and that's what we're talking about. If you do have questions or concerns, you can reach out to us, or you can reach out to your local authority as well. But you're absolutely right. It is the safety, it is knowing what you're looking at. We often get certain questions, for instance, with regards to the X-ray on the wall. Does that have radioactive material in it? Mm. And for somebody that perhaps isn't the dentist, that didn't have to take further courses for the practice manager or for another member of the staff, they're not sure. They see that radiation warning sign, and that does pose a bit of a threat. It's a bit intimidating. But just first, I will state that no, there's no radioactive material within the unit itself.
I've never even asked myself where is the radioactive material. I've never even asked that of myself. And you're right. Dental assistants, I mean, I'm talking about a long, long time ago when I did my dental assisting training, but I can't remember any great in-depth training around the radiation
Of
side.
course.
So when you think about it, quite possibly majority of your team members in any one practice are not
Yeah.
specifically trained in this space. So what is made up of that machine?
Sure. So basically, there are two main components. One of which is the generator, which is where the power comes from. That power is applied to a tube head, which has a negative and a positive sealed in a vacuum tube. The electrons are then, sorry, I'm going to get a little bit technical. I hope I don't bore you too much.
Yeah, no.
So you basically, and this is actually how they were found, is by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895. He was actually playing or doing experiments with a Crookes tube, which is a cathode ray tube, which was the prototype for your modern dental x-ray. And basically what you're doing is you're applying a very high voltage to the negative end of this x-ray tube. They're flowing in a uniform pattern through this sealed tube. They're hitting a hard substance, usually a tungsten, and that impact from the electrons into that hard proton of the metal is creating a release of photons in the form of X-rays that are then filtered through the tube head and then used in your dental practice for your imaging.
Wow, I could not repeat that to anybody. But I am
It comes out slightly different each time.
So when were X-rays first developed, and what was the guy's name again?
Sure. So that was in 1895 by a German physicist and professor named Wilhelm Röntgen. So he was, as I mentioned, he was doing some experiments with the known rays of light. So for the majority of us, we can see a scale of light. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So when we're looking at a rainbow, those are basically the main regions of light that our eyes can see. But on either end of that spectrum, there are wavelengths of light, and it's all about the energy of the wavelength. So once we get past violet, we have ultraviolet, known as UV rays, which are damaging from the sun. Especially here in Australia, we know all about UV rays. We're wearing sunscreen, we're wearing protection to prevent damaging to our skin. And as you go higher onto that spectrum, they have a higher wavelength as well, so a higher energy. And then you have our three types of X-rays. So you have your alpha, which is the least penetrating or the lowest energy. Then you have your beta, and then you have your gamma. Gamma rays are normally specifically, and that's actually the name of our company, is Gamatech. Gamma rays are normally specifically talked about in nuclear reactions or in nuclear radiation. And this is found from the nucleus of the atom as they're decaying, as they're changing states. They are ionizing, and as they change states or as they lose an electron from their valence band, energy is released. So that's why we have radioactive material, which are very, very high energy. So as I said, they were first discovered in 1895, and the physicist Wilhelm Röntgen wasn't sure what he had discovered, so he labeled them as an X-ray, with the X as the mathematical symbol of the unknown. And that has stuck since.
Wow.
So recently, after he found his discovery, he published a paper on it. And 2 weeks after that paper was published, another German doctor, a dentist by the name of Dr. Otto Volkoff, he took the first radiograph of his own mouth. Interesting, what took him 25 minutes in 1895, or it would have been the beginning of 1896, 25 minutes for a standard bite wing.
Wow.
So we can tell you from our today's standards, that would be very, very high risk. That would probably, the technology we don't think would be the Alara principle, which we'll get into later. But so it took him 25 minutes to get a very, very poor image of his own mouth. But so since then, since 1896 to today, technology has tenfolded. But with that, the technology on the tube head, the generator side, as well as the safety side. So there have been regulatory bodies put in place to administer and to decide what is safe. how much radiation is safe, how where's the risk versus the reward, and things like that. So it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, a long time coming. And so at the start, was it a little bit of like, whoopsie, to actually indicate that to actually find out and discover we think there's a damaging impact on these as well?
It actually took quite a while. For the first few years of X-rays and of playing with the technology, it was in some areas they were saying radiation heals. In other areas they were using X-rays to measure your foot size for a shoe.
I remember seeing pictures on Facebook memes about
Yeah,
around that. Yeah.
yeah. So it wasn't until many years later that they said, "Oh, hold up, wait, there are side effects to radiation," and so that's when kind of the governing bodies and the authorities in the science community got involved to let's discuss and figure out what is actually happening and why is it dangerous.
Okay. So the danger side at that extreme early end of radiation, or it's radiation poisoning, so it's burning, killing tissues off, necrosis, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's on an atomic level. You can't see the damage, but it's damaging your cells. It's knocking an electron off this one and it creating a damaging cell. And over time and excess radiation, the damaging becomes unrepairable by our bodies. But that's on a large scale over a long period of time. That's not going to happen from your general dentist.
Yeah, that's it. We're talking more like the gamma rays. Is that what you're talking about, where you've been exposed to possibly environmental radiation for a long period of time?
That's right. Or for instance, what happened with Mary Curie when she was doing all of her experiments in the early 1900s with uranium and things of that nature. She did win a Nobel Peace Prize, actually two, for physics, but she also died of radiation poisoning, being one of the entrepreneurs or the pioneers of the science. It's just a little bit unfortunate that the regulations weren't in place as she was discovering it.
Yeah, quite a big cost to that little award. Not little
Yes.
award, that substantial award. And so when we're talking about dental radiation, the one, being in a general dental practice as myself over the years, it's your periapicals, your bite wings, your OPGs. More over the last number of years, it's been LATCEFs and everything that's around implant work. Are there any other types of radiation that we're talking about when we're talking about dental radiation?
Well, no, you nailed it there. There is the intraoral, which is what we do for our bite wings. From there, that is basically the benchmark or the staple unit in any dental practice, is having an intraoral X-ray unit. The next step up, as you mentioned, was the OPG, or the orthopantomograph. These type of imaging gives you the full 2D panoramic of the whole teeth and jaw. There you're able to see your roots, your canals, even the mandibular nerve, things of that nature. You also mentioned the Cepharm, newer with the OPG, but also even more recently is the dental cone beam, or the dental CBCT. This type of imaging is kind of your next step up from the OPG. The actual unit itself is very similar. The process is very similar. You stand in the unit, or you stand in the cone beam, and a head rotates around your head. And what it's doing is it's taking hundreds of single shot X-rays, very, very low dose single shot X-rays. And the CT side of that, or the computed tomography side of that, it takes each of these single shot X-rays and it forms a 3D image with them. Much like in regular X-rays or a regular CT unit, this is specifically for dental.
And with the digitization of all the X-rays, the amount of radiation required to take the image has far reduced, hasn't it?
That's correct, very much so. And certain things are put into place as well. For instance, if you take a dental cone beam, you can also extract your OPG from it. You can extract your bite wings from it. So the cone beam itself may be a higher radiation dose, but you're getting 3 or 4 or 5 different modalities or out of the single image.
Yeah, fantastic. So I remember back when what year would it have been, 1990, around that time, the way we managed whether the radiation, the memory I have about managing radiation back then, were these little clip-on red things that had a little a radiation film inside them, and you'd wear them as a dental staff member,
Sure.
and then they got sent off somewhere every couple of months or month or 6 months. I can't even remember how often it was done, and they would track whether you're absorbing too much radiation. Things have changed, I imagine, since then.
Yeah, so that principle that is still an option. There are still radiation monitoring tags is what we call them. They can be provided by ARPANSA, which is the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Society. I'm sorry, I'd have to double check that acronym, but they are one of the governing bodies on radiation safety and nuclear safety in Australia. And just like you said, in New South Wales, they are not mandatory. But a lot of dental practices will still take them to feel safe. And like you said, it is every 3 months, so 4 times a year, you hand in your old radiation tag, they'll send you a new one, and they monitor the accumulative radiation exposure. So for in New South Wales, for anybody working in the occupation, a dental practitioner, a dentist, someone in the field, there are specific levels that their radiation monitoring tag must remain under for them to be safe and to continue practicing.
And I remember even back then, there was such the people that were untrained in radiation, you could see that there was that knowledge gap, because some dental nurses would leave their radiation tags in the surgery when they're not actually working there. So it's being exposed to every x-ray that's being taken in the surgery. And so there is such a need for us to be properly trained in this space. There is potential harm there. So what are the risks that have been identified for dental radiation for dental team members?
Sure. Great question. Because when you're working with ionizing radiation, there's always risks involved. The first thing that we like to say at Gamatech, as I mentioned earlier, the best way to stay safe in any situation or in any practice is to be educated. So we do have a few principles that we like to, especially with new staffs. The first one would be to keep your distance. When you're in a practice and somebody is going to be taking an x-ray, and depending on the practice, so if a practice has a large open surgery and you remain in the room during intraoral x-ray, that can be okay, as long as you keep 2 meters minimum. That's the mandatory requirement, is 2 meters from the tube source and the patient. That 2 meters gives the primary radiation and the scatter radiation dose enough distance to dissipate to a negligible amount. So it's not going to affect you at that 2 meter mark. So some practices will even put a tape on the floor to make sure you're behind this tape if that x-ray is being taken. The second principle that I'd like to bring up is communication. Especially within smaller dental surgeries, it's one of the easiest things to do is to communicate. I'm in surgery 1. I'm standing outside the door. Please don't walk in front of the door while I have this in my hand and I'm taking this x-ray. Communication is key, especially in smaller practices. And I would say the third principle, which probably should be the first, is to make sure that your equipment is up to date with its compliance testing and certification. Because the CRE, as I mentioned, the consulting radiation expert, they are accredited by the EPA here in New South Wales to make sure and run tests to make sure that your equipment is safe, it's operating correctly, and it's within its tolerances and within the regulations.
Beautiful. Now, you mentioned before the ALARA principle. You've mentioned it a couple of times. Is it a good time now to talk about the ALARA principle?
Certainly, absolutely. So the ALARA principle, it's actually an acronym for as low as reasonably achievable, and basically this is used to determine, first of all, if the rewards of taking an x-ray outweigh the risk of the x-ray to the patient. Now, in today's modern dentistry, 99% of the time, that case is that yes, it is such a low dose, it's such a low risk to the patient, and the information provided to the dental practitioner is so great that, of course, it definitely is, for most cases, the right thing to do is to take the x-ray. Certain ways that the advancements of technology allow us to use the ALARA principle on kind of on a greater scheme, I would say, is, for instance, with the dental cone beam. I'll trace back to the dental cone beam, because with these modern devices, you have the ability to focus in the radiation. They have several fields of view for the X-ray. So if you have a particularly problem tooth or particularly problem region of the mouth that you want to specifically zone in on, you can choose a field of view that will captivate just that part without radiating the entire face. And things like that really allow the Alara principle to come into play, because you're able to get what you need without a higher dose of radiation.
Absolutely. And so with that focusing down on the radiation, so we're just going down to a couple of teeth at a time, or even if it was a bite wing,
Sure.
radiation doesn't just focus it. There is as you said, I think it was called scatter, isn't it?
Sure. So scatter radiation is with all X-rays, and it's basically a secondary form of radiation. The primary is the beam from the X-ray source. So as you fire an X-ray, the beams of light, the photons of light, the very, very high energy photons, pass through the soft and hard tissue. Now, the majority will go through, and the lack of photons and the presence of photons is where you get your black, your whites, and your grays on your X-ray. But some of what happens is, with some of these photons, they'll interact with the atoms of your soft and hard tissue, generally the soft tissue of your mouth. And that's because the atoms of the soft tissue are easier to knock off. They're easier to come into contact with. So what that means is that as you're firing the photon perpendicularly to the beam, you will get stray radiation, which is a secondary form of radiation that comes out from the patient perpendicular to the beam. And that's often what is kind of missed in dental practices. People often understand there's the X-ray tube. It's being faced in this direction. So if I stand here, I'm fine, but that's not the case, because if you're still too close within that 2 meters, the secondary radiation is still ionizing, and it still can be harmful.
That's where, so as long as you're 2 meters away from the machine and the patient, any scatter radiation will be quite negligible by the time it reaches you. Would that be right?
That's correct. That's
beautiful.
Correct. Yep. The 2 meter rule, keeping your distance.
I like that. I like the thought of having a little marking on the floor as well to indicate exactly where they're supposed to be. Because, sometimes people bring their kids in as well. And to be able to say to all the members of the family, quick, back behind the line is a very good place to go.
Exactly. Need some police caution tape.
Yeah, that's right. Little flashing lights. So you've sent through a very helpful guide for me. There's both radiation management licenses and radiation user licenses. And we did a recent podcast episode on, and there was an updated ruling around the licensing side of things, I think it was. So what's the difference between the management license and the user license?
Sure. So the radiation management license is for the owner of the radiographic equipment and for the premises of the practice. The radiation management license must include, so you go through the EPA in New South Wales. This can all be done on their eConnect website to apply for or make a variation to your license. The radiation management license is for the premises and the owner of the equipment. So if you're planning on opening a practice, or if you have a practice and you're planning on bringing in X-ray equipment, you must have a radiation management license. Secondary to that, you must include and add each piece of X-ray equipment, of radiographic equipment, to that license. Think of it as if you purchase a car, every year you must get a rego check. After 5 years of owning that car and updating your registration every year, you have to get a pink slip or a safety slip. That's the same as a dental X-ray equipment. 5 years worth of radiation management licenses. Every year we update it. We make sure it's current. And then after 5 years, we come in and we do a pink slip or a radiation safety check or a compliance testing to keep it up to code and to make sure you're within the regulations. The radiation user license is a little bit different. That's for operating the equipment. Now, there are provisions in place in New South Wales where a dentist doesn't necessarily need a user license for an intraoral X-ray. Now, talk to your CRE, talk to your local authority to see if that pertains to you. But anybody in New South Wales who is operating a OPG or a cone beam, a dental cone beam, does require a user license.
But not necessarily intraoral images in New South Wales.
That's correct. There are a few provisions in place, especially for dental students as well. So, for instance, if a dental student is being trained by somebody that is qualified, then they won't need one during their training. But just double check with the requirements and with the radiation management license.
That's an interesting point. I'm going to double check that, certainly. That's very interesting. So the radiation management license, it needs to be updated every year so we make sure it's accurate, but the actual compliance testing doesn't have to happen until every 5 years.
That's correct. We like to think of it as your car registration. So just like your car registration, if you buy a new automobile, every year you have a rego, it comes in the mail, you pay the money, and it gets up and your registration is updated. Similarly to your radiation management license, you will get in the mail, you'll get a notice of renewal. But then every 5 years after the X-ray equipment has been installed, you will be required to get a upgraded compliance test and certificate. Yeah.
And is that notified every 5 years as well? Or do we need to put reminders in our own schedules to make sure we get that done?
Well, that's the thing. And this is another reason why we're really out there trying to help with this, is because as of right now, there isn't a system in place to remind you. There is just your word, and there is just your own remember. And often, as I mentioned before, with the turnover in staff, this is often one of the last things that are passed on is, oh, don't forget that in 2 years and 4 months, our equipment is due for compliance.
I myself have sat in a surgery and we've all just been chatting because the patient was turning up late or what have you. And one person says, do we ever need to get this serviced? Where's the sticker on this machine that indicates we're supposed to do something about this?
Yeah.
I'm a big supporter of encouraging dental teams to have some kind of reminder system in place for all of the equipment maintenance, etc., and just something simple like Google Calendar, like just have that active in some way, because isn't that one of the most helpful ways? We need reminders. There's no way we're going to remember these things. So if we've got a piece of radiation equipment that we go, whoopsie, there's no way in the past 5 years I've had this compliance tested, what does that actually mean? What are the repercussions or the ramifications of that?
Well, lucky for them, I'm not the person that's enforcing it. So there are the EPA themselves, they do have radiation officers that do audits of this information. And coming out, we're not sure exactly when, but within the next little while, 1 to 2 years, I believe, the EPA is coming out with their eConnect portal. And this is going to be a transparent system between the dental practice owner, the EPA, and the CRE, the consulting radiation expert. And on this platform will be the radiation management license, the updated compliance certificates, and everything that pertains to them. So the EPA won't have to go to your practice to see your physical certificate. They can check on the portal and then send you a reminder. If you are negligent for an extended period of time, there are penalties, and you can go on the EPA website to find out exactly what they are and how much the fines do cost. One thing, just to touch on what you said earlier, or just in the previous question, you're absolutely right. We need reminders, and with Gamatech, we do that for you. So if you are our customer now, if you're our customer now, and we've already done this year's, we will notify you prior to your expiry in 5 years, and we'll set up a convenient time to come in and redo it. There's one other option we do have. If you're not our customers yet, but you don't want to think about it, we do have on our website our compliance calendar. And basically, you just enter when it's due, whether it's 1 month, 1 year, or 4 years and 10 months. We will then reach out to you in the same fashion and say, hey, your x-ray is coming due in 1 to 2 months. Please let us know a convenient time and we can organize the compliance for you.
That's super. That's very good. Now, you said the CRE, Consulting Radiation
Expert.
Of course, I get it. There's so many acronyms that we're using today.
Exactly.
Well, that's good to know because so if anyone feels like that they're lax in this space, they can, and especially if they're in New South Wales, they can contact you and get the whole thing up to date now, and there's not going to be any bad repercussions from you guys
That's
to
right.
them.
Yeah, that's right. And the main thing, again, what we're trying to push is just the safety aspect of it. Dental x-rays generally pose a very low risk, but it only takes one poor performing x-ray, either with leakage from the tube head or there's been damage to it or something's happened. And it only takes one poor performing unit to cause a problem for somebody. And we're trying to get rid of even the possibility of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's actually required in the compliance testing process, and how much time can they not use that surgery for when you go out there and do the testing?
That's a great question. We do know that downtime in the practice is not looked happily on. So we do try and minimize that either by coming in after hours or on weekends, working with the practice to minimize their downtime because time is money. So for a general intraoral x-ray, depending on the unit, you're looking at about 30 minutes per unit. It doesn't take very long. There is a standard group of tests that we do for each device that make sure that each of the parameters, each of the settings of the device are within their legal and regulatory limits. For an OPG, you're looking at about twice that time, about an hour. There is a few more tests that are involved and a few more parameters that we do, as well as initiating and implementing the quality assurance program. The dental cone beam as well, similar to the OPG, you're looking at an hour, 1 to 2 hours, depending on the device and how many modalities it has.
Yeah. And regardless of whether it's an intraoral x-ray machine, OPG, all 5 years, every 5 years, the same?
That's correct. Yeah, for dental.
Beautiful, beautiful. And what's the best way, if you were a brand new practice owner and you were setting yourself up with radiation licenses, management licenses from the very start, and they want to make sure that they put proper structure and systems around this new x-ray machine, what's their best path?
Sure. So anybody who's looking to take over, renovate, or open a new practice, my first thing I would say is open Radiation Guideline 7. And this has all of your information about radiation shielding. 9 times out of 10 for an intraoral x-ray, for the actual surgery size that it's going to be installed in, 9 times out of 10, you can position the chair in a way that makes the room big enough and for far enough from each of the walls that no further shielding is required. And that's the easiest way to save time, money, etc. All of these are found within the EPA Radiation Guideline 7. So if you open that up and you kind of assess each of the rooms, you can determine if it's a low, medium, or high risk. And from there, follow through the list, consult a CRE if required, or if you believe it to be required. But that's the general guideline for before you even bring the equipment in. Afterwards...
So in some situations, do you need that insulation, the lead line walls in the surgeries? Is that a current regulation, or sometimes it's required and sometimes it's not?
Right now, it is considered industry best practice. And for the OPGs and the cone beams, it all depends on the amount of scans per week and the distances from the walls. Also what's on the other side of the walls. So if you have a OPG going into a 4 meter by 4 meter room and no one's going to be in that room, then and you're doing less than 10 scans a day, then there's no added requirements. But as the room gets smaller, depending on what's on the other side of the room, and as the amount of scans goes up, then we look into what we should do to keep the practice safe.
And what about if there's no OPG, we're just doing intraoral imaging in a dental practice, or a start from scratch dental practice?
Yep.
So there's a chance that they don't actually need to have that lead line insulation within the practice walls. It still just depends on the amount of use.
The amount of use and the size. In that guideline, it'll show you, it has a diagram of a typical dental surgery examination chair, and then distances to walls, even just gyprock walls, as long as you're, and I'm just going to ballpark it, as long as you're 1 to 2 meters to each gyprock wall, and you're only doing, say, 50 scans a week, then you're right. No extra shielding would be required for that. But always, again, best bet is to double check the guideline and consult a CRE or the EPA directly if you have further questions.
Beautiful. And I did interject then. So this new practice that's setting themselves up, they want to start off on the right foot. They've identified which X-ray machine they want. They've got their location. What's their next best step with you guys with Gamatech to make sure that they are compliant and reminded and doing all the right things?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. On point. So again, after you've determined you've purchased your equipment, it is now installed. Now's the time to make sure you hop onto the EPA eConnect website and get your radiation management license. Now, either the person who's installed the unit themselves or perhaps the CRE that you're going to call next to come and compliance test it, they can provide you with the specific information from the unit that is required to add it onto your license. So normally what I do when I go to a new dental practice, I would ask them if they've already updated their license. If they've said no, that day I would provide them with all of the information. And if required, I can help them step by step through the list of requirements on that website. It's very straightforward. So most of them can do it without me. But then that way, at least it's in the system. The EPA knows that they're adding licenses. On their end, they'll do a quick approval of it, of the added devices. And once they've been added onto your license, the EPA will provide you with an RRM number for each device. And that stands for your radiation regulated material number. And the CRE will require that to add it to the certificate to then present to you to have in your files.
Beautiful. The next step is if you were purchasing an ongoing practice, should you really be making sure that their compliance and documentation's all up to scratch and up to date as part of that sale contract?
I would say definitely. 9 times out of 10, you're going to find everything's sound, everything's to regulation, but definitely check. And one thing, if you are buying it from somebody, and this is actually a peer and friend of mine at the EPA, it's a bit of a pain point for them at the moment because oftentimes the retiring dentist, they're already at their cocktail party, they're enjoying retirement, and they often forget they've signed the paperwork over to the new practice owner, but they haven't transferred their equipment from their license to the new license, and that becomes a problem because the radiation management license then expires with equipment still on it. And the EPA is trying to find out, was it decommissioned? Was it disposed of? Was it transferred? So that's definitely something you want to do before you retire or sell your practice, is make sure that all of the X-ray equipment, if it's still functioning and it's still installed, just go back onto that EPA eConnect website and have a variation where you transfer it onto a new license.
Beautiful, beautiful. And the other scenario that's in my head as well, you've got a practice, you've got very old X-ray machine and it's not working and you need to get rid of it and buy a new one. How do you how complicated is the management of an old and faulty X-ray machine that you want to get rid of?
That is a great question because it's often asked. So one place you can find the requirements is actually on your radiation management license. In one of the bullet points that we all kind of just skim past, there is a small section on disposing of your X-ray equipment, but it's really not that hard. The one main requirement in New South Wales is to cut all of the wires to the tube head, deeming it inoperable. That means that you can't just go plug it back in and fire it up and take X-rays. And then basically you can take it off your wall and it can go to the tip.
Fantastic, because there's no big block of radioactive material in that
That's
machine.
Right. It's just metal, wires, a bit of glass in the tube head. But then just make sure after that, you then go back onto the, sound like a broken record, but you go back onto the eConnect website and you make a variation to your management license saying that it's been decommissioned and disposed of.
So this eConnect portal is going to be fantastic, but it's not yet in operation. Is that correct, or it's coming?
It's currently not mandatory. So just recently it has been introduced. We are trying to get everyone onto it. but a lot of people want that physical piece of paper or that email. So we're doing a little bit of both at the moment. We're providing a certificate and we're trying to introduce the portal. It isn't mandatory, but the EPA eConnect website, where you do all of your radiation management license, your user management license, that is active, and that is a very valuable tool for your radiographic equipment.
So if you haven't looked at this space for, months, years, and you're a practice manager out there or practice owner out there, and you are thinking, where are we at with our management license? The best thing to do is to go onto the EPA Connect website, and it house the information, whether you're up to date or not?
Yeah. So if you can go onto it, you can log on to it, and you can see where your license is, and it'll show you if you have one that's current. It'll show you the previous one if it hasn't been updated. So yeah, you'll do everything through there. If you have questions, there's also a hotline you can call that will patch you through to the EPA directly, and they can help you through the process.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's very good. It's a very important area to make sure that we are up to date on, and to develop, a standard operating procedure. This is our management of not just the X-ray machine, but all of the stuff around the X-ray machine as well, just to make sure that we are all compliant on track. Might even be a good idea, unless you guys do it already, that you do have some sort of sticker that you put on your machine itself. So when you are just walking past the machine and think, gosh, are we up to date on that? You've actually got a sticker there that proves that you actually, just like with you were mentioning before about with your cars, just like you do with your service of your car.
Exactly.
You look on the corner of your windscreen and they've put a wonderful little sticker there that tells you next time when you have to actually address this as an issue.
You're on point, and that is something that we do. We do have our mandatory radiation sticker, your yellow sticker that says radiation produced when energized. So that's on the machine. And then we do also have our GammaTech certified next compliance due certification sticker, which is just a little silver sticker with our little logo and the date, pretty much.
That's all you need.
Yeah, exactly.
That is excellent. That is excellent. So if anybody out there wants to find out more about radiation safety and making sure that they've got a really great standard operating procedure around that, their best place to go to is...
There's a few choices. You could go onto the New South Wales EPA website, where you can find all of the required information. Another great resource is the ARPANSA website, who works closely with the EPA and with another acronym, which is AXSUM, kind of tough to say. So our PANSA website, the EPA website. Also feel free to hop onto our website. We're constantly updating as much information about requirements, regulations, and safety. We've actually just started a blog as well, where we're going to be constantly putting in little safety tips and regulatory advice, and that's at gammatech.com.au.
Oh, that is tremendous. I might start sharing them on my Facebook site.
Please feel free to.
Constant source of good information. And links to all of those things that you've mentioned is all going to be in the show notes as well. So if anyone's out there going, what are those acronyms again? It's all going to be linked up in the show notes. But if people are interested actually to come straight to GammaTech and get things compliant and on board, what's their best next step?
Sure. We have a few different channels. You can reach out to us via telephone. We have our gammatech.com.au website. And on there, if you just kind of go through the different tabs at the top, we have a few, what our services are, what we provide, what your regulations are, your requirements are, things like that. So if you want to hop onto our website, give us a call or email us at service@gammatech.com.au. We can happy to answer all of your questions and any concerns you may have.
That is absolutely tremendous. Have we spoken about everything radiation?
No, I think we have. And again, I'd just like to say thank you so much for giving us the platform to just bring it to the attention of the people and to the dental community. And we, through no fault of their own, we know that this information is dry, it's boring, excuse my language, it isn't sexy. And it often just kind of goes by the wayside, because if the machine feels like it's working fine, they're still getting good images, it's often the last thing on your mind. And we get that. All of these dentists, dental practitioners, you study dentistry to be there for the patient, to be able to help the community. And often the last thing on your mind is the machine on your wall. And that's where we come in. It's our number one priority. We see your machine as if it was our patient. So yeah, again, thank you for giving us the platform and to have this chat.
That's my absolute pleasure. And when I first started this podcast, I wanted it as a way of really promoting awareness around the number of people and companies out there that are providing fantastic services that we just don't know about. And I have been constantly amazed at how much gold there is out there that we don't know about. So thank you for coming on board and providing this link to your company, to Gamatech, to make this space within dental practice management even easier. So thank you so very much, Makenzie. You've been an enormous assistance.
It's been my pleasure. Very nice to meet you, and hope we get to do this again soon.
Hope to do as well. Fantastic. Thanks, Makenzie.
Cheers.
Hey, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, you should join the club. The club members receive an online lunch and learn twice a month where I share insights, systems and strategies to improve the success of your practice. These lunch and learns could not be easier to train your dental team. They are recordings, so you can watch them at a time that suits you. For example, during team lunchtimes, pay your team members for their lunch hour. The first half hour, they're eating and watching the presentation. The second half hour, they're discussing how to implement this particular insight into your dental practice operations. And remember my favourite quote, it's by Archilochus, and he states, "We do not rise to the level of our expectations, but fall to the level of our training." So join the club now and start upskilling your team members and improving the operations of your dental practice. I hope to see you there.